Hey everybody, welcome back. In this video, we are finally introducing citizens into our city. We're also overhauling our UI with this new and improved minimalistic toolbar. We're adding a title bar where we can see our bank balance, the title of our city, and the current population, as well as a new and improved info overlay so we can drill down and get more information about our city. I'll be walking through every bit of code step by step, so let's get right to it. So before we can add citizens to our city, we need to spend a few minutes refactoring our old code. If you want to skip over this part and jump right to where we're adding new citizens, feel free. The timestamps are in the description below. And the first thing I'm going to do is to change our buildings code to a factory function to make it more consistent with the rest of our code. So I'm going to export function, create building, and then we'll pass in the building type here. And then these are going to be declared as separate functions. And I will do the same for the commercial, industrial, and road as well. All right, so I've split out these into separate functions. So now we need to pick the right function based on the building type. So we'll switch on the building type. And let's be sure to add a default case. So if they specify a building type that doesn't exist, then we'll log an error. So we've replaced our weird dictionary thing with a factory function. So be sure to update all the references to the old buildings object to this new function. Okay, so there's two last bits of housekeeping that I'd like to do before we go about creating our citizens and revamping the UI here. So one is taking our create tile function and moving that to a separate tile. So this is going to expand over time. So I like to move it into a new file now. That way the logic for our city and the logic for the individual tiles is kind of separated out into different files. Let me go ahead and create a new file here. Call that tile.js. And I'm just going to cut that and paste that in here. And then we'll need to export this function. And in our city file, we'll of course need to import create tile from that tile file. Tile file, that's a fun thing to say. I also want to expand our tile a bit more. There's not really any methods on our tile. We have some properties here. But I'd like to add some more methods in here. So there's some operations that we're performing on our tile, and I'll try and find them here. So when we're using our active tool, so this could be, either bulldozing a building or placing a new building on a tile. Right now we have that logic embedded in here. So I want to move the bulldoze and the place building functions into our tile as methods. So we tell the tile to either remove a building or add this building, and then it does all the in between for us. So let's find bulldoze here. Gonna copy that, paste it in here. And I'm gonna actually rename this to remove building. And I actually don't need these log statements anymore. So now this is going to be calling the remove building function on our tile. And I forgot to remove this parameter here. That is not needed. Add a little documentation. So you might be wondering what the difference is between undefined and null. Undefined means that the variable, or the property in this case, has not yet been initialized. It does not have a value defined. Whereas null explicitly just means this thing has no value. This is more contextually appropriate for what I'm trying to represent here. These values have already been assigned, but they're assigned to nothing. And I know I've made that mistake in other files. I'll try to fix it as I go. Oh, I forgot to put one more line in here. After we remove the building, we of course need to update the scene to let it know that we've removed the building. And place building, that's also going to come out. And that's going to be another method. So this is actually going to be the building type we now need to pass in. Delete these log statements. And we need to import this function. And then in our game, let's go back and do tile.placeBuilding, building type. And just to make this more readable, set building type equal to the active tool ID. And then need to update the city. All right, so that cleaned out our game a bit more, refactored some of that code into tile. I just kind of like to have these things separated out. So the term I would refer to that as is single responsibility principle. You know, our tile object should hold all of the responsibilities and functions and properties and everything needed for that tile. Our game shouldn't be the one controlling how a tile should remove its building or how a tile should place a building. We want that logic in this object itself, and that just makes it easier to think about these things and having all the logic in one place. That's why I keep continually doing this refactoring. Okay, I think that is... Oh, I need to... This should be this. The reference to the tile is now this object that we were in. All right, with all that housekeeping out of the way, we can finally start working on some new functionality. So let's create a new file here. And let's call that citizens.js. And yes, we're finally going to add some citizens to our game. So let's start by creating a new function here called createCitizen. There's kind of two different ways to simulate a city. You can simulate it kind of in an abstract sense. So you have these buildings and you can create some models for how the buildings might respond to crime levels and pollution levels. I thought about that for a long time and I couldn't really figure out how to model that in a way that really made sense. So the second approach, and that's the one I'm going to go with, is actually modeling each citizen that lives in the city. So of course, this is a bit more computationally intensive approach. If you have tens of thousands of citizens living in the city, you have to kind of simulate all of their behavior every second. That could be a lot, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm not going to try and optimize for something that I don't even know is a problem yet. But by modeling each citizen individually, it allows me to create some logic that makes a lot more sense. So, you know, if someone can't find a job for 30 days, then they're going to leave the city. And if enough people leave a building, that building might become abandoned. Or if the pollution levels go up, those people might become sick, and that's going to maybe impact the death rate of the city. So it's a lot easier to think about that in terms of the people rather than trying to abstract that behavior at like a building level or a city level and write some equation for that. Let's get started by defining the object for our citizen. So of course we need a name, give them an age, and then they also are going to need a place to live. So they'll have a property called house. So we'll need an update method. And since the citizen state might depend on adjacent tiles or really anything within the city, we're going to pass our city data model into our update method. Right now, let's add a comment not implemented. So this is the very basic model for our citizen. So let's just start with this and then we'll go from there. So in our city, I'm going to add a new property called citizens. And this is just a one-dimensional array. And this is where we're going to keep all of the different citizens that live in our city. So now that we've created our citizens, we need a place for them to live. How I think this will work is I'm in our buildings file now, create residential building. So in the update method, in here, I'm going to have citizens move into this building kind of at random. So we need to add some properties here. I'm going to add a new property called residents, and will be an array. So this is an array of residents that live in this building. And we'll also need another property called max residents. Let's set that 4. This is the maximum number of people that can live in this building at one time. So in our update method, if the number of residents currently living at the building is less than max residents. Let me close this so we have some more room. So if the number of residents currently living here is less than the maximum number of residents, then we want to create a new resident. I need to import that up here. Or sorry, create citizen, not create resident. So this will be create citizen. And it looks like I forgot to update these to be methods. Let me quickly change that. Okay, so we create our citizen, and then we're going to add that citizen, which I called resident. We're going to push that into our array of residents for this residential building. So we also want the citizen to know that it lives here. So let's go back to our create citizen function, and let's pass in house. Use the shorthand property notation here. This will add a property to our citizen object called house with the value of house. So this is going to be a reference to the residential building object that it lives in. And then we'll pass in this right here. And then the last thing that we need to do is in our city, we need to be able to add that resident or add that citizen to this array here. So when we're updating our buildings, let's pass in our city data model. And then I'll add city to all these update methods. We've created the citizen. We've added it as a resident of this building. We also want to add it as a citizen of our city. Then we'll just log. Do a quick log statement here. Now, if I place some residential buildings down, of course, we get some errors. City is not defined. And want that to be this. Clear our console. Buildings down. City.citizens is undefined. Let's see. Yep, I did not add it as a property here, so it's currently just a private variable. By adding it to our property list, that will expose it. All right, one more try here. Lay down some buildings, and there we go. We can see that a whole bunch of citizen objects have been created. Obviously, we just gave it the name of John Doe and just a static age here. But we can look at the house here and see what house it was added to. Now, it's kind of hard to know what house this is referring to. There's really no unique identifier for this. So I just realized I forgot an I here. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, we don't really have a way of uniquely identifying buildings. So I think we should add a unique identifier on our buildings. So typically the most common thing that you use for a unique identifier is called a UUID. So we can actually import the crypto module, and that'll give us a random UUID. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. So let's add this to all of our different buildings. If I lay down those residential zones now, and I'll just look at one of these citizens in our house, you can see that there's a unique identifier. This is a very long, complicated looking string. So each building is going to have its own unique identifier that we can reference it by. And we use UUIDs because there's so many different possibilities for the value of the UUID that you're basically guaranteed that there will never be a collision with another UUID. So if I click on another John Doe here, we can see that this ID begins in 473, whereas this one begins in BA6. So we can see that these John Does are actually being added to different buildings. So this isn't very exciting having all of our citizens name the same thing. This is kind of more like the Clone Wars or something like that, where we're just cloning the same person over and over again. So let's create some code in our citizens file that allows us to randomly generate names. So I'm actually going to utilize ChatGPT for this. I could try and come up with 25 names on my own, but I really don't want to have to think of that and type that all out. I'm going to ask ChatGPT, can you please write some JavaScript code for an array of 25 different first names. I want a mix of young and old names as well as male and female names. And look at that, it even broke it down into the separate categories. Kind of interesting. So let's copy that, paste it in there, and then we'll say, can you please do the same thing with last names? And I guess the one caveat here is it is English-speaking countries. I guess we're fine with for now. And there we go. Let's see if we can take this one step further. I like doing this with ChatGPT. Can you write me a JavaScript function that will generate a random name from these two arrays? All right, so it saved us a little bit of time. Just want to copy this part here. Actually delete this old bit. And this will be a private function inside of our create citizen object, or create citizen function, I'm sorry. So this will be, instead of John Doe, we're going to do generate random name. So for the age, let's generate a random age between 1 and 100. So do 1 plus math.floor, 100 times math.random. This will generate a random number, a floating point between 0 and 1. Multiply that by 100. That'll give us a number between 0 and 100, or a floating point number. So this excludes 1. So it'll never quite be 100. And we'll take the floor of that to get an integer. So it'll be between 0 and 99. So if you add 1 to that, it'll be between 1 and 100. We'll save that, expand this out, and we'll go back to our game. Now, if I lay down these residential buildings, pull this up here, so you can see that we get all these fun names: Margaret Green, Olivia Williams, William Lee, William Moore, and we get a whole variety of ages. So we no longer have the Clone Wars going on in our city. We have a whole bunch of different people living in our city. All right, so we finally have the bare minimum that we needed to represent citizens in our city. We can generate random names, random ages. We give them a place to live. Our residential buildings know what citizens are living inside of them. We can have citizens move into those buildings. And at the city level, we can also keep track of all the citizens living in the city. So that's kind of the basics of the data that I wanted to get down and code in this video. So the rest of it is going to be doing a complete revamp of our UI. All right, everyone. So I regret to inform you that when I was editing all the footage for this video, I realized that about halfway through my screen capturing software had just completely crapped out. And I had lost all the video from this point on. I still had all the audio, but of course, without the video, doesn't make much of a YouTube video. So I had to go back and manually revert all of the changes I had made between now and the end of the video. And that's not really an exact science. I tried to do the best I could while preserving the changes I had already made. So if you see something that doesn't quite make sense, that's probably why. But unfortunately, we just got to keep rolling with the punches here. And we're going to move on into the next section. And that is overhauling the UI. So currently we have these nasty looking text buttons. They take up a lot of screen real estate. So we're going to change these to icons, and that'll make this toolbar a lot narrower, give us more real estate for our game. Additionally, we're going to add a title bar at the top, and that'll show the current amount of money we have in the bank, the title of our city, or the name of our city, and the current population of the city. And then finally, we're going to move this info panel here. We're going to move it kind of to be a floating panel over on the side here. We're going to revamp how we're displaying content within that. We're going to use HTML instead of just stringifying JSON. That'll look really nice. So we're going to start by adding some icons to our toolbar buttons. And to do that, we actually need some icons. So one place I really like to go to is icons8.com. So I can search for, let's say, bulldozer, and it'll give me all of these icons for bulldozer. I like these filled ones here. This is actually from the iOS 16 icon set. So I can click download, and that'll give me all these different sizes of icons. So I'll stick with the 50 by 50 size here. That's large enough for what I need. So I'm going to go ahead and download icons for all of these buttons, and then I'm going to add them in a new folder underneath our public folder here. All right, so we have our icons added. So you can see, well, can't see very well, but I have a bulldozer, a factory, a house, office, play pause buttons, a road, and your traditional pointer for select. So now we need to go and get these icons into our buttons. Let's scroll down here. Hide that so we can see a bit better. So all of this text here needs to be replaced with an image element. And then within that image element, we will reference our new icons. All right, so I've added those image elements as child elements of our buttons. So within each button, we have an image element here. I've added a toolbar icon class to each of these images. So that allows us to size and style each of these icons uniformly. And then the source, of course, points to the path of that icon file, where it is within our directory structure here. So I've done that for all of the buttons, including the pause button down there. Now we're going to be recreating this info panel here, so I'm just going to blow that away completely. And then I'm going to move our pause button inside this div here to bring that right underneath our road. So the next thing that we need to do is update the styling on our buttons. So I want to make them square with some slightly rounded corners. And we're going to reduce some of the margin and padding in this toolbar here. Let's go over to our CSS. So I'm going to make a few tweaks here. One, this info panel is no longer needed. We removed that element. So let's delete that CSS. For new UI toolbar, let's remove the width constraint here. And then let's change the padding to, say, 8 pixels. All right, now we need to shrink this up a bit. So that's being driven by our buttons right now. They have a width of 100%. Let's change that width to 50 pixels. So that makes that a bit tighter. So it looks like our layout is a bit screwed up here. So let's go back into our HTML document. And it looks like we have an extra div here. So the flex box that we have on our UI toolbar, it's not being applied to all of our buttons. So they're not being aligned vertically here. I'm going to go ahead and remove this div. There we go. All the buttons are now aligned vertically and on the left side of the screen. And we want to change how these are spaced. So let's do flex start. So for those of you that might not have a ton of experience with CSS and might not know what Flexbox is, I highly recommend this guide on csstricks.com. So if you scroll down a bit here, they have some really awesome diagrams on how Flexbox works. So you can see how the order attribute works, flex direction, flex grow. So we can use this to control how items might grow proportionally to one another. If we want one item to grow 2 times more than the ones next to it. Wrapping. The one I just changed is justify content. So we had it set to space between, which meant it kind of took up that whole length of the toolbar, which you didn't really want. We wanted flex start. We wanted that top item aligned with the top of the toolbar, and then all of the items after that, all the buttons after that to follow closely. So highly recommend looking at this resource if you're not super confident in Flexbox. This is basically the only thing that I use to learn Flexbox, and it's been super valuable for me. All right, so back to our buttons here. Obviously, our border radius is a bit too extreme, so let's change that to, let's say, 3 pixels. We have some nice square buttons. And let's get the margin a bit smaller so these buttons hug a little closer to each other. There we go. And our box shadow is a bit too wide, so we'll change that. I'm going to try removing the border. Let's see what that looks like. I think I need to do border none to get rid of that default button border. So the last thing we need to do here is get some sizing on these icons. So if you remember, I created a class called Toolbar Icon. So we need to add a new selector here, Toolbar Icon. So we'll set the width to, say, 40 pixels, height to 40 pixels. And then another thing that we're going to need to do is set pointer events to none. And this will prevent those icons from intercepting mouse events so that they don't get through to the button. So that's something that I found out in testing. That's why I'm adding that in now. Icons are still a bit too big. I think that looks pretty good. We need to get our icons centered in there. So let's do a quick flex box here. Justify center. And align items center. This is a quick trick to get things centered in both axes, and there, that's looking really nice now. So there we have our toolbar all set. Let's make sure everything's still working. And you might notice that our buildings now start off as 1 unit high instead of flat to the ground. That's another one of those changes that kind of got messed up during the video corruption, so I apologize for that. Commercial buildings, industrial buildings, roads. And of course, we don't have our info panel anymore, so we can't see any information about these buildings, but looks like the toolbar is working. We'll just check the pause button. So our pause button appears to be broken here, so let's get that fixed. So for our pause button, we need to toggle this icon based on the pause state of our game. So if we're looking at the pause button right here in our HTML code, so you can see that when you click on it, it's going to call game.togglePause. So for our toggle pause function here, we need to replace this with code that will change that icon. Let's go ahead and update that code now, and then I'll talk through it. All right, so I've rewritten this to change that icon. So the first thing that we need to do is toggle the pause state, of course. So if the game is currently paused, then we get our pause button icon image element, and we change the source attribute on that to a play icon. And likewise, if the game is currently in play, then we need to change that icon to the pause button. So let's toggle this right now, and you can see that that's working. So our next order of business is adding a toolbar at the top of our game window here. So let's scroll down in our HTML code and locate the render target div. So I'm going to add some new elements underneath here that will represent that title bar at the top. All right, so I went ahead and added that code in. Let's close that, and I'm going to talk through this. So the parent element that I added is called title bar. So I give an ID of title bar. And within it, we have 3 separate divs, and that's going to be title bar left items, title bar center items, and title bar right items. So if you can imagine the title bar up here, I want to break this into 3 separate sections that we can add any kind of element to. So this left third here is going to contain the current balance of our bank account. The middle third is going to contain the title of the city. And the right third is going to display the population of the city. And you can see I've kind of set up some placeholder values here. Notably, we have a span element for our population rather than just giving it a number there. So how this will work is when our population is updated, we'll go and locate this element in our HTML document, and we'll set its value to the current population. So let's go ahead and add some styling for this title bar. All right, so I added in some styling. So let's talk about what each of these styles does. So first of all, position fixed. That makes sure that the title bar is fixed at the top of our window. And then to constrain it properly to where we want it, we'll set the top to the very top of the window. Left is set to 66 pixels, which just kind of aligns it with the right edge of our toolbar here. Setting right to 0, we'll pin it to the right edge of the screen. And obviously setting the height, we'll set the height of that toolbar. We set the background color to a fairly transparent black. We gave it a bit of a larger font size to make it more readable. So we used Flexbox to control how these item groups are laid out. And then on the item groups themselves, we have a class called Toolbar Icons. Our selector for that is right here. We set flex grow to 1. That ensures that all of these grow proportionally to one another. And we've done another flex box inside of these item groups so that the bank account balance, the title, and the population. So we want to make sure those are centered vertically and horizontally within those item groups. So there we go. We have our title bar all set up. One very minor tweak here, I see that our population value is butted right up against the population label. So I'll add a little tweak here to add some margin to that. So now that our title bar is set up, we need to make this population counter dynamic. So in our game, we need to add a new function that will update that population counter. And we will update that population counter every time our city is simulated by 1 step. All right, so I've added a new function here called update title bar. This is a very simple one-liner. So it gets the population counter element. Then we're going to set the inner HTML of that span to the current population of our city. Now we've not yet defined this, so we're going to do that shortly. But let's scroll down to our update method and let's make sure that every time we update our city that we're updating our title bar as well. So of course, it's not going to do anything quite yet. We need to implement this city get population method. Let's go locate our city file. And then let's scroll down and add a new method here. All right, so our get population method is very simple. All we are doing is returning the length of our citizens array. So we can see in our HTML inspector here that this element is flashing yellow. So that means that every second this element is being updated with a new value. So we should be able to lay down some residential buildings here. And then as people move in, we can see that population counter is slowly incrementing. So we still can't click on these and see who's living inside of them. And that's something that we're going to take on right now. So next, we're going to work on adding a info overlay panel here so that we can click on our buildings and see information about them. We're back in our index.html document once more. Let's scroll to the very bottom here. And we're going to add a new div underneath our toolbar. So let's collapse the toolbar and title bar. We don't need to look at that. And I'm going to add a new div underneath here. All right, so I added a div with some child elements, and we're going to call this info overlay. It's kind of laying over the game scene. So within that, we have 2 child divs. So we have our info overlay header and info overlay details. So the header is just going to be a little title bar, and then the details is going to be the actual content that we're going to display in that overlay. So let's go into our CSS document and get some styling on this. All right, so we've added some basic styles to our info overlay here. Let's walk through what those are all doing. So as we did at the title bar, we set the position to fixed, and we anchored it in the top right corner. So we gave the top a value of 50 pixels, and that pulls it down below the title bar a bit. And then just gave it some margin and padding to give some breathing room. We set the width as a fixed width of 300 pixels. And then just some styling to give it a bit of visual flair. We did a background color, kind of a lighter color relative to the background. So we made that semi-translucent white. A border radius of 8 pixels, and then a bit of a box shadow to make it pop against the main background of our scene here. And then on the header itself, we set the font weight to bold just to give that a bit of pop. So now that we have our overlay, we need to actually populate it with some information. So how this is going to work is that on each element that we want to display in there, so that could be a tile, it could be a building, or it could be a citizen, we need to represent the state of that thing as text. So I'm actually going to represent it as HTML because that allows us to style it a bit. So let's start with our tile. We're going to scroll down to our object here, and we're going to add a new method called toHTML. So let's get that code in here, and then we'll talk through how that works. All right, so we've added our toHTML method to the bottom of our tile object here. Let's walk through this. I'm defining an empty string called HTML. Then I'm appending actual HTML code to that string. As you can see, we're displaying the coordinates of our tile, so the X and Y position. Then we do a line break, and then we're displaying the terrain of that tile. Right now, everything is just labeled as ground, so it's not very interesting, but I assume later on we're going to have water, maybe like desert and sand and mountains and things like that. So this is just thinking ahead. So we had another line break, and then we drill down into our building. So our building is also going to have a toHTML method as well. So if there's a building on the tile, we can go ahead and call toHTML on the building and append that to our HTML variable here. But for now, I just want to get this populated so that when we click on a tile, it'll show the information for that tile. And then we'll go back and we'll implement the toHTML method for the building and for the citizens. So let's go into our game. So let's rename this to update info overlay, be a bit more accurate. And then we need to replace this line here. Right, so I've updated this so that when we're updating our info overlay, we're going to get the info overlay details element. So just remember that that's this child element here that sits below the header. And then we're setting the inner HTML attribute on that element. So if tile is not undefined or null, then they're going to return the value of toHTML. Otherwise, we're just going to set that to nothing. So now if I go ahead and click on a tile here, you can see that this info overlay is being updated with that toHTML result. All right, so now that we know that that is working, we need to go ahead and do the same for the building and for the citizens. So let's go into our buildings file. And we will start with our residential building. And we're going to do it for each building. We're going to add the toHTML methods. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll walk through what that looks like. All right, so I went ahead and added the toHTML function to the residential object here. So let's walk through what this is doing. So it's very similar to what we were doing with the tile. We're defining our string variable here, HTML, and then we're just appending all of the information about that building. So here I'm using HTML to bold this subtitle here. And then I'm just populating the type, style, and height of the building. Now, of course, our residential buildings are a little bit different. They actually have people living in them. So we're adding a separate section here. So what's going on here? We're adding a subtitle called residence, making that bold. And then I'm building a list here, an unordered list. So I set some styles on it here just to reduce the padding a bit. Things are indented a bit too far. If we have any residents living in this building, then we're going to loop through each resident, and we're going to add a new list item. And that list item is going to contain the toHTML result for that resident. So you can see this is kind of recursively going down the chain of dependencies here. You start at the tile, go down to the building, go down to the residence. This is a very flexible approach that we can kind of expand upon as our game gets more complex. So if there's no one living in the building, then we'll just show a list item of none. And we close out the list with an end tag here. Then we return that result. So let's quickly look at the commercial and industrial buildings and roads. So you can see they're exactly the same as the residential building, except there's no residents in those, obviously. So we're just showing the basic attributes for the building. Now later on, once we start tracking where our residents are working, where they're shopping, we can actually display that information here. All right, so let's go into our citizen and get that final toHTML method implemented. And then we'll see what that all looks like. So for our citizen, it's even simpler. All we're doing here is we're creating a span element, and within that, we're showing the name of the citizen. So that's the full generated random name and the age of the citizen. Let's make sure we have all of our ducks in a row here. So we have our citizen done. We have all of our buildings done. Making that call right here for our resident. And then in our tile, we need to append the HTML for that building. So now I'll lay down some residential buildings, some commercial buildings, industrial, and roads. So if I click on the ground, we get the information about just the tile itself. If I click on a road, you see we now have this new section. So a building is of type road. If you click on industrial, we get a bit more information. We get the style and height of that building. So the height of this one is 2, so we can see that difference there. We can see the different styles that result in the different textures on our buildings. Let's click on commercial now. That's basically the same as industrial. And residential. So this is where it gets fun. We can see all of the residents that are living in each of our residential buildings. We have Robin Green here, who's a centenarian, I think is the word for that. And we have Sophia Lee, this little baby living in this building. So this is really cool. We can kind of get a magnifying glass into our city and see where our people are living, and eventually kind of track the lives of these people around the city and how they're using the different resources within the city. All right, so I think that about wraps it up for this video. It's been a lot of content packed into this one, so don't want to throw too much at you guys. So to kind of recap what we've done, we did a bit of refactoring. We added citizens to our city. So now we can finally click on our buildings and we can see the different people that are living there. We did a refresh of the UI, so we have the smaller toolbar here that uses icons instead of the text. We added a title bar, so you can display our bank balance, the title of our city, the current population. We've done a lot of cool stuff. It's starting to feel like a real SimCity game, I feel like. The next few videos are going to be focusing a lot more on the logic of the city and less on code refactoring and doing overhauls of the UI. We spent a lot of effort on that in the last few videos, and I feel like we're finally in a good place for that now, where we can start making some big headway. So thank you all so much for tuning in and watching these videos. I hope you enjoyed this one. Just a reminder, the source code for this is linked in the description below. It's completely open source, so feel free to clone the repository, play with it, fork it, whatever you want to do with it. If there's certain features that you'd like to see in future videos, please leave those in the comments below, and be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Lets me know that you guys are enjoying these videos and getting some use out of it. So until next time, take care everyone.